Hey, we're back with another episode of Before You Buy, that show where we give you some straight up gameplay and our first impressions of the latest games releasing. It's me, Jake, and yes, Eric, Falcon, and I have been really busy this week with Before You Buys. Today we took a quick look at God of War Sons of Sparta. We've heard rumors about this game, this potential like God of War Metroidvania thing for a while now, and now they just released it completely out of the blue during Sony's State of Play show. This is just like a classic shadow drop for a pretty significant game. It's not just a new game in the God of War universe, it's actually a full-on return to the old thing, the Greek saga. They even brought back the original Kratos voice actor, T.C. Carson, to narrate the adventure. It's cool. It essentially stars a young Kratos in training, well before the events of all the stuff, the first God of War game, all that. This is developed, I guess, co-developed by Sony Santa Monica Studio and Megacat Studios. And this is both like I'd say slightly less and slightly more ambitious project than some of us expected to see. It's a Metroidvania with a pretty detailed 2D art style, kind of reminiscent of something like Blasphemous, but it mixes in elements of both the original God of War trilogy and a couple little gameplay elements here and there from the more recent Norse God of War games, with a particular focus on the bond of brotherhood between Kratos and Deimos, a character that was introduced in the PSP Ghost of Sparta, which not a lot of people remember, but if you played it, you bet your ass you remember it. So it's very cool to see him here. So really, in essence, this is a spin-off of a PSP spin-off from the main series. And while it looks very different from like the original games, it still manages to capture that little feel here and there. The big question is if it's any good. Sure, the pedigree is there, and they've clearly put a lot of effort into this thing, but how does it actually play? Is it a good God of War game? Is it a good Metroidvania game? There's a lot of questions, and to be honest, we're still working through our thoughts. This is gonna be very much like a first impressions kind of before you buy, because while co-writer Eric and I here, we both jumped into the game like right after it got released last night, it is proving to be a lot bigger than we expected, a pretty expansive experience. It starts small and then it gets much bigger. There's a pretty good amount of game here and we're not finished yet. So just so you know, also this footage is captured running on a PS5 Pro and is as spoiler-free as possible. Now, with all that said, our general impressions here are pretty positive. The pixel art might look a little bland. It's got that kind of overly clean pixel art that we've seen here and there, but what sells the visuals for us is how varied it can be. They've clearly put a lot of effort to make diverse and visually interesting backgrounds, at least. It's not all just generic caves and corridors here. And the combat is fairly solid, too. They're definitely going for that original trilogy feeling where enemies take a lot of hits and orbs pop out of them and you're like a tank. Dying comes from 1,000 cuts rather than a few misplaced hits. This isn't something like Silksong where your health is extremely crazy limited. You have a decent amount right from the start, and they give you an ability called the Spirit Strike to restore health by doing damage to enemies. This kind of makes for an interesting push and pull. I love when games mess with this type of mechanic. It makes you think and alternate between standard attacks to restore spirit energy and then spend that spirit energy attacks to restore health or break an enemy's shield and leave them vulnerable for a finisher. Like, there's actually some depth to the combat overall. You have a dodge, you have a block, and a parry that looks and feels exactly like it does in the mainline game with the shield. Killing enemies and breaking objects generates all kinds of little orbs that fly into and restore your health, or give you more blood or mana, or just the stuff you'd expect from the old games. And you have a lot of moves and abilities to unlock in skill trees with those said blood orbs. The part that feels the most like the modern Norse games, I think, is the way the crafting and upgrade system works and how the menus look. You can level up your equipment using various materials while resting at a camp, or go to a blacksmith who will make you new weapon parts that you can then attach and swap on your weapons. Now, like I said, the interface of all this stuff is pretty much taken from the newer games, and like those games, there is a good amount to sort through here. There's a lot of stuff to collect, from resources to things that upgrade your stats to new weapon parts and all these different little collectibles in between that. It's frankly almost a little overwhelming how many random little things you can pick up when you look at the map, but the game at least doles out the necessary upgrades to collect this stuff evenly across the game, it seems like. So you're pretty consistently moving forward and you feel like your character is progressing. And so far, the pacing and flow has been pretty good. There are temples where you unlock new sub-weapons, which are used for fighting enemies and unlocking new paths and alternate paths. And superficially, this is like pretty standard Metroidvania stuff. You run around, you fight enemies, you explore and find upgrades and unlock new stuff that makes it so you can reach new areas. What makes this one a little different is how it leans into that God of War formula. So the focus is on combat, puzzle solving, and some story progression. It's paced like one of the modern games where you're mostly following a story, and then once an area is cleared, you can come back through it to find actually all the collectible stuff. And then once an area is cleared out, you can come back through it to actually find all the collectible stuff. This is a surprisingly story-driven game, and while the concept of playing as like a young Kratos boy might feel a little strange or a little pointless considering how this whole story ends, you know, they actually managed to get us interested in what was going on. Even though it's a story about a young Kratos told to his daughter that he eventually kills, and his brother, who we already know dies tragically as well. Look, putting away what I know about where the story eventually goes, like they actually managed to still tell something that seems to be pretty interesting, and it incorporates some little historical things here and there, like from Spartan culture. It sort of feels a little bit like what Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown was doing, where they intentionally tried to explore Persian mythology in an interesting way. This game kind of does that with ancient Greek culture and their gods. Obviously, the mainline God of War games, you see them in all their glory, but they try and add some other stuff here. It's not all just fire and brimstone and Zeus and Ares. There's a lot more to it, and this game understands that so far.
Vasilis is no wrestler. If you expect the elders to select you for the Olympics, I suggest you train with more challenging foes.
You offering?
So while our impressions overall are pretty positive, there are some annoying things here and there. You know, like we said, the art is generally good, but it does feel like in some spots, in certain areas, it lacks some personality. There's just something a little bland about some screens sometimes. Like, I'm glad it's not just another Hollow Knight clone or something. They could have just done that, but I still feel like something a little bit more striking could have set the game apart. Still, like we said at the start, like it is highly detailed art for what it is. The animations are generally pretty damn good, and they perfectly translated a lot of the classic God of War monsters into 2D. Look, I'm biased, I'm an easy mark. I tend to get pretty nostalgic for the OG God of War. And if you're like me, you're gonna be excited to see like a Minotaur pop up, or like all these other things, or even down to like when you open a chest, it kind of looks and feels like old God of War. Little stuff like that. Look, if this was all just some elaborate scheme to get people excited for the newly announced God of War trilogy remake thing, then it is working. There are also some cool references here and there, especially in those backgrounds, that I kind of appreciated. One of the biggest things I noticed right at the start, though, is that the game is a little stiff. The controls aren't quite as tight as they could be. That stiffness so far has actually made some of the bosses feel a little harder than I think they needed to be. Like, if you want to jump after dodging, then there's a slightly longer than you'd expect delay. So a lot of the time when I wanted to jump, I would just stay on the ground. Wall jumps have a similar problem, like with input, where you're holding any direction and then there's like a long delay before you can then jump off of a wall that doesn't feel as natural. You know, you've probably played a bunch of games, you have wall jumped a million times. In God of War, it takes a second because the input is a little weird. Blocking and striking feel better, and for the most part, the controls are fine, but the few moments of awkwardness do stand out, and I do hope they go back and fix some of this stuff. I just want it to feel a bit smoother. These games excel when they play like butter, like a Dead Cells or a Symphony of the Night or something like that. And as far as the gameplay goes, though, like I said earlier, it seems well-paced, it's pretty fun, it has a good amount of challenge, and it seems like there's a decent variety of monsters, both old and new. And the story manages to be intriguing, despite feeling kind of inconsequential. The music's also very good. They brought back the Norse trilogy composer, Bear McCreary, to do some pretty cool, pretty suitably epic tunes that so far seem to like seamlessly transition into more melodic, kind of retro-inspired compositions that actually work really well together. To be a little reductive, think of like some of the ambient exploration Skyrim music suddenly kind of intertwined with some cool retro jams. It's not as corny as you'd expect. It's actually pretty natural. It really works. That soundtrack, we got no complaints at all. And in fact, I really don't have too much more to complain about overall. So far, it seems to be a well-made and fairly well-constructed game. The puzzles are fun, there's a decent amount of exploration, the environments mostly look good. The only problem is that there's no big hook here. There's nothing all that flashy or like crazy exciting about this game. It's polished and mostly well made, but it doesn't open with some big bombastic starting sequence like a lot of God of War games. It's not really trying to sell itself to you. It's just letting the solid mechanics and good pixel art speak for itself, and it's kind of got like a chill vibe to it. Like, it's not going to get you pumped up and hyped. It's kind of like a lo-fi experience more than anything, which is an odd thing to say about a God of War game, but that's been our experience with it so far. It's a God of War spin-off game with solid fundamentals, but not a whole lot of flash. There are definitely better Metroidvanias out there. It has been a long-mastered genre, but as a smaller, but still far from small, 2D take on the God of War formula, there is a lot to like here. Look, I don't know how hardcore God of War fans are gonna feel about this, like how they're gonna think of this one. Obviously, in terms of tone and structure, it's feeling a little bit more like the modern Norse games, but still, like I said, there's some good nostalgia here for those older games, and a lot of callbacks and references, but it's not as bloody and gory and crazy. In fact, in spots, Kratos is actually kind of nice. Is that sacrilege? I don't know. But it certainly makes it interesting. It adds a little bit more layers, a little bit more depth to his very long-running character at this point, so it's cool. But that's a before you buy. You know how this goes by now. We give you some pros, some cons, and some personal opinion, and now we want to hear yours down in the comments. Are you like us? Did you jump in right away when the game was available? Are you working your way through it? We'd love to know your thoughts so far. If you like talking God of War with us, anything at all, clicking a like button helps us. We appreciate it. But after all the videos this week, I'm going to go to bed. Thanks for watching. I'm Jake Baldino. See you guys next time.
It's not stealing if we don't get caught. Spartan law.
But aren't the gods always watching?
Common misconception.
You're crazy.